There are moments in the Imperium when belief does not simply crack, but turns inward, folding on itself like a blade. Moments when the very symbols meant to anchor humanity's faith begin to feel wrong in the hand, their weight unfamiliar, their edges suddenly sharp. This is one of those moments. Somewhere in the vast machinery of the Imperium, on a world that once sang hymns without question, an Imperial saint stands amid incense and ash, no longer certain whether the voice they hear belongs to the Emperor, or to something that has learned how to sound like him. Saints are not chosen lightly. They are forged in suffering, elevated through sacrifice, and bound by doctrine so tightly that doubt itself becomes heresy. And yet history records whispers of exceptions, of figures canonized too quickly, venerated too desperately, whose miracles did not fade with time but warped, deepened, and began to demand a price no one had agreed to pay. This is not a tale of sudden damnation or cartoon villainy. It is the slow, suffocating story of faith under pressure, of survival turning into obedience, and obedience curdling into something the Imperium no longer recognizes until it is far too late. If you find yourself drawn to these forbidden edges of Warhammer 40,000 lore, where belief, fear, and power collide, then consider lending your support. A like, a share, or a subscription is not just encouragement. It is a signal that these darker stories still deserve to be told, carefully and without flinching. In the long shadow of the Emperor's light, the world had been burning long before anyone thought to call it holy. Long before hymns echoed through its manufacturum halls or pilgrims wore their knees raw against its stone. It was a place defined not by miracles, but by endurance, an imperial planet whose name mattered less than its output, whose population was counted in quotas and losses rather than lives. The sky above its primary hive never fully cleared, choked with the residue of promethium exhaust and the drifting ash of distant bombardments. Even at midday, the light arrived dim and jaundiced, filtering through smoke like a sickly memory of a sun. People learned not to look up. There was nothing there worth seeing. The one who would later be named a saint did not begin as anything rare. They were born into the press of bodies and noise like everyone else, raised beneath rusted gantries and flickering lumen strips, where the air tasted of metal filings and stale incense. Prayer was not a comfort here. It was a reflex, murmured before shifts began and whispered again when they ended, a road insurance against accidents that came anyway. The Emperor was distant, vast, and unquestioned, less a presence than a constant pressure, like gravity. You did not feel him watching. You felt the consequences of forgetting he existed. War arrived the way it always did in the Imperium, without explanation, without apology. 1 month there were rumors passed between hab blocks and work lines, half-heard fragments about greenskin raids in the outer system, about Astra Militarum regiments diverting course. The next, the sky thundered with re-entry burns, and the ground shook beneath the weight of armored columns moving toward the front. Sirens became part of the soundscape, as ordinary as the clatter of machinery. The manufactorums did not slow. They never did. When shells began to fall on the lower spires, workers were simply rerouted. Their paths adjusted around rubble and bodies with the same impersonal logic used to optimize production. It was during those first weeks of collapse that the future saint became noticeable, though no one would have said so at the time, not because they spoke loudly or claimed visions or performed anything that could be called a miracle. They endured. When hab sections lost pressure and people suffocated in sealed rooms, they dragged survivors free with bleeding hands. When ration convoys failed to arrive and panic spread faster than hunger, they organized queues, enforced calm with nothing but a steady voice and an unyielding refusal to break. Faith, for them, was not eloquent. It was functional. They prayed because it gave structure to chaos, because reciting the catechisms of protection, while shells fell overhead was better than screaming. The saint's first so-called miracle was an accounting error. A shell struck the outer wall of a transit chapel where hundreds had taken shelter, collapsing Ferrocrete and killing dozens outright. The blast should have breached the reactor lines beneath the floor. It did not. Later, a tech adept would insist the margin of safety had been miscalculated, that the damage reports were wrong. The ecclesiarchy would insist otherwise. To the survivors, shaking, ash-covered, alive, it felt like intervention. The saint had been there, kneeling at the altar when the impact came, voice unbroken as the walls shook. That detail mattered more than any data slate analysis ever could. Word spread the way rumors always do in the Imperium, unevenly, distorted, sharpened by need. People began to look for the saint during bombardments, to cluster near them in shelters and ruined basilicas. Not because they promised safety, but because they did not promise anything at all. They simply stayed. When fear turned crowds violent, they stood between armed men and unarmed families, invoking the emperor not as a threat, but as a witness. It was not bravery in the heroic sense. It was exhaustion refined into resolve. The ecclesiarchy noticed only when the numbers shifted. Attendance at sanctioned sermons dipped while unsanctioned gatherings grew. Pilgrims ignored official relics to press close to a living body still caked in dust and blood. A junior confessor filed a report noting unregulated devotional focus, flagging it as a potential risk. The document would sit unread for weeks, buried beneath casualty tallies and supply requisitions. By the time a senior priest arrived to investigate, the war had worsened, and the people were already calling the saint by titles no one had authorized. The saint themselves resisted at first. They corrected people when they knelt. They redirected praise toward the emperor with an almost desperate insistence. But belief is not a thing that listens. It accumulates. It presses inward. Each time someone survived after standing near them, each time a prayer uttered in their presence coincided with good fortune, the weight grew heavier. The saint began to feel watched not by the emperor, whose gaze was an abstract constant, but by the people themselves. Their eyes followed every movement, searching for certainty, for permission to hope. When the Astra Militarum formally reinforced the hive and pushed the enemy back, relief swept through the population like a sedative. In the aftermath, when the dead were counted and the ruins consecrated, officials began looking for symbols to mark survival. A world that had nearly broken needed a narrative. It needed a reason it had endured when so many others had not. The saint was summoned to speak before ranking officers and robed clerics, their words recorded and transmitted far beyond the hive's walls. They spoke simply, urging gratitude, urging remembrance of the fallen. They did not realize, until much later, that the moment they stepped onto that platform, survival had ended and something far more dangerous had begun. The ceremony that followed was meant to be temporary. A single address, a controlled appearance, a sanctioned moment of collective relief before the machinery of war and labor ground forward once more. That was how it was explained to the saint as they were escorted through corridors, scrubbed clean of blood but still smelling faintly of burned promethium. Adeptus Arbeit stood watch at every junction, visors opaque, shock malls resting against armored thighs. Servitors trundled past with censers swinging from their frames, trailing incense thick enough to sting the eyes. The saint noticed these details because they had learned to notice everything. When survival depends on reading the room, you do not stop just because the room has become holy. They spoke again of endurance, of the emperor's will expressed through collective sacrifice. They avoided the word miracle entirely. Still, the crowd roared when they finished, a sound so loud and sudden it felt like a physical blow. It was not joy. It was release. The saint felt it wash over them, felt the heat of it, the way it filled the vast nave and pressed against their skin. For a heartbeat, just one, they understood the danger. Not as doctrine, not as heresy, but as instinct. This was power. Not the kind wielded by lasguns or orbital batteries, but something softer and far more volatile. Afterward, they were not returned to the hab blocks. That detail was almost lost in the noise of congratulations and ritual blessing. Instead, they were given quarters within a fortified basilica complex, modest by ecclesiarchal standards, but impossibly luxurious compared to the world they had come from. Clean water flowed without ration chits. Meals arrived regularly, warm and dense with calories. The saint ate mechanically, barely tasting the food, unsettled by the absence of hunger. Even comfort felt like a kind of theft. Petitions began to arrive within days. Some were formal, sealed with wax and stamped with the Imperial aquila. Others were scraps of parchment smuggled past guards, ink smeared with desperation. People asked for prayers, for blessings, for intercession. They asked for sick children to be touched, for names of the dead to be spoken aloud. The saint did what they could, hands trembling as they traced the sign of the aquila over bowed heads. Sometimes the sick improved. Sometimes they did not. Both outcomes were recorded carefully, but only one was repeated. The ecclesiarchy framed it as guidance. A senior priest explained how saints had always functioned as conduits, how belief itself could align the soul with the emperor's light. He spoke in soothing tones, his voice practiced, his smile thin. The saint listened and nodded and said nothing about the nights when sleep refused to come. About the dreams where they stood alone in the chapel, candles guttering, while a vast silence pressed close from all sides. In those dreams they prayed, and felt nothing answer back, not warmth, not condemnation, just an absence so complete it felt louder than any voice. War did not truly leave the world. It receded, pulling back to a distant horizon where artillery thunder became a dull, constant echo. Refugees flooded into the hive from outlying settlements, carrying stories of things that had gone unrecorded, of skittery patrols enforcing compliance with machine precision, of entire hab clusters razed because evacuation schedules had failed. These people sought the saint out not for miracles, but for acknowledgement. They wanted someone to hear what had happened to them. The saint listened until their throat ached and their hands shook, until the weight of unprocessed grief threatened to crush them. It was during one such gathering that the title was first spoken aloud in their presence. Saint. The word cut through the murmur of voices like a blade. The saint corrected the speaker immediately, voice sharp with panic. Murmurs rippled outward, confusion giving way to uneasy silence. An ecclesiarchal attendant stepped forward, smiling gently, and smoothed over the moment with practiced ease. Titles, he said, were not for the individual to choose. They were bestowed by the emperor, recognized by his servants. The saint understood. Then that refusal was no longer an option offered in good faith. Official investigations followed, framed as verification rather than interrogation. Adeptus Ministorum scribes cross-referenced testimonies, discarding inconsistencies, highlighting patterns. A visiting magos from the Adeptus Mechanicus scanned the chapel ruins where the reactor breach had not occurred, muttering Binhuric prayers as data streamed across their lenses. No definitive explanation was offered, but uncertainty itself became proof. In the Imperium, absence of contradiction is often enough. When the declaration finally came, it was delivered as a blessing. The saint knelt as relics were displayed, and litanies recited, their names spoken in conjunction with words like intercession and divine favor. They felt smaller than ever, crushed beneath layers of meaning they had not consented to carry. As the ceremony ended and the crowd surged forward, hands outstretched, the saint looked out over the sea of faces and realized that whatever They had been before worker, survivor, witness had been stripped away. They were no longer enduring the war. They were becoming part of it. Night inside the basilica was never truly dark. Lumen globes burned at all hours, their pale light reflecting off gilt iconography and polished stone, erasing any sense of time. The saint lay awake on a narrow cot, listening to the distant hum of generators and the softer, more unsettling sound of whispered prayers seeping through the walls. Even here, even behind sanctified barriers and armed guards, people gathered. They always gathered. The saint could feel it as pressure rather than noise, like a weight pressing inward from every direction. For the first time since the war had begun, they wished for the anonymity of the hab blocks, for the simple brutality of survival where no one expected anything more than breath and labor. Their body began to betray them in small ways. Fatigue lingered no matter how much they slept. Their hands trembled when they tried to hold still, not with weakness, but with something closer to contained force, as if motion itself were building pressure beneath the skin. The ecclesiarchal medicae assured them this was normal, a consequence of stress and spiritual exertion. Saints, they explained, often bore the cost of intercession physically. Pain was framed as proof. Discomfort became validation. The saint nodded and accepted the explanation because there was no alternative that did not end in accusation. They were taken beyond the hive soon after, escorted through streets still lined with makeshift shrines, bearing their likeness rendered in cheap ink and scavenged pigments. Seeing their own face reproduced so carelessly unsettled them more than any battlefield had. The Imperium's need to catalog and replicate moved faster than memory, faster than truth. Outside the hive, the devastation was total. Flattened settlements stretched to the horizon, their remains already marked for reclamation. The saint was asked to bless the ground, to sanctify soil soaked with blood and promethium. They complied, voice steady, though each word tasted like ash. It was there, amid the ruins, that something happened which could not be dismissed as coincidence so easily. A crowd pressed too close, desperation overriding discipline, and a panicked guardsman raised his lasgun. The saint spoke without thinking, a single word carried on instinct rather than intention. The weapon did not fire. Its power pack ruptured instead, venting heat and light harmlessly into the air. No one was hurt. The guardsman stared at the smoking ruin in his hands, then dropped to his knees. The saint felt a sharp pain lance through their skull, brief and blinding, followed by nausea so intense they nearly collapsed. Reports of the incident spread with terrifying speed. The ecclesiarchy recorded it as a sign of divine protection. The Astromilitarum recorded it as an equipment failure. The saint recorded it as fear. Something had moved without permission, something they had not prayed for or understood. That night, they vomited until there was nothing left but bile and silence, kneeling on cold stone while incense burned uselessly overhead. From that moment on, the saint began to sense a distance growing between themselves and the emperor they had always believed in. Not abandonment, not judgment distance. Prayer felt like shouting across a void that answered only with echoes shaped suspiciously like expectation. When they spoke publicly, their words carried weight beyond meaning, bending crowds toward calm or fury with subtle shifts in tone. They learned to choose phrases carefully, to avoid anything that could be interpreted as command. It did not always matter. People heard what they needed to hear. The ecclesiarchy, satisfied with momentum, prepared to move the saint again. Other war-torn worlds needed symbols. Other populations needed proof that survival meant favor. The saint was informed, not asked. They were a resource now, their presence calculated alongside troop deployments and supply lines. In private, a senior priest offered reassurance, speaking of duty and destiny with equal reverence. He warned gently that doubt was a luxury best surrendered early. As the transport lifted from the scarred surface of the world, the saint looked down at the hive that had shaped them. From orbit, it appeared almost peaceful, its wounds hidden beneath cloud and shadow. They felt no pride, no triumph. Only a growing certainty that whatever force now moved through them had begun as belief, but was no longer content to remain so small. And somewhere deep within the Imperium's vast grinding machinery, that certainty was already being weaponized. The final rites of canonization were conducted with meticulous care, as if precision itself could contain the forces being invoked. The saints stood beneath vaults blackened by centuries of candle smoke, listening to litanies older than the world they had come from. Each word had been tested, approved, and repeated across millennia, designed to elevate without inviting scrutiny. The saint felt those words settle around them like armor that did not quite fit, rigid where they needed to breathe. When the declaration was spoken, when their name was bound permanently to sanctity in the ecclesiarchy's ledgers, a cheer rose that shook dust from the rafters. It sounded, to the saint, uncomfortably like relief. From that moment forward, the war was no longer something happening around them. It followed. Wherever the saint went, conflict seemed to sharpen, lines drawn more clearly, decisions accelerated. Refugees calmed at the sight of them, yes, but commanders grew bolder too, invoking the saint's presence as justification for risk. If the emperor's favor walked among them, then sacrifice could be demanded with cleaner conscience. The saint began to notice how often their image appeared on banners raised before assaults, how frequently their name was spoken in the same breath as orders. Faith had become momentum, and momentum does not stop easily. They tried to intervene where they could, urging mercy, restraint, remembrance of the human cost. Sometimes it worked. More often, their words were reinterpreted, filtered through vox grills, and second-hand retellings until caution became resolve and resolve hardened into command. The saint learned that once belief leaves the mouth, it no longer belongs to the speaker. It belongs to whoever needs it most. On the eve of departure for their next assignment, the saint returned alone to the chapel where the first shell had fallen. Repairs had erased the damage, but the memory lingered, heavy in the air. They knelt where they had knelt before, pressing their palms to stone worn smooth by generations of prayer. They asked, quietly, for guidance. Not glory, not power, just clarity. The silence that answered was complete, not hostile, not comforting, simply vast. As they rose, escorted once more by guards and incense-bearing servitors, the saint understood something with a cold, settling certainty. Whatever path lay ahead, it would not allow for retreat. Survival had led them here, step by step, each choice reasonable, each act defensible. Apotheosis had not arrived as fire from the heavens, but as paperwork, ceremony, and need. And if faith could elevate a single exhausted survivor into a symbol strong enough to bend reality at the edges, then it could also demand things no one was prepared to refuse. The saint boarded the transport without looking back. The world below faded into cloud and shadow, another entry in the Imperium's endless accounting of loss and endurance. Ahead waited other wars, other crowds, other moments where belief would be tested against necessity. Chapter I closed not with revelation, but with acceptance, the quiet, dangerous kind that allows the next step to feel inevitable. The first thing the saint learned was that holiness does not travel lightly. Wherever the transport touched down, it left impressions deeper than its landing struts crowds already gathered. Shrines hastily assembled from scrap metal and prayer strips. Ecclesiarchal banners unfurled before the engines had even cooled. Word always arrived ahead of them, distorted and enlarged by distance. By the time the saints stepped onto new soil, they were no longer a person in the minds of those waiting. They were a promise. Expectation filled spaces faster than incense. It hung in the air of cathedra and field chapels alike, thick enough to taste, pressing against the chest with every breath. People did not ask if the saint could help. They assumed it. The saint moved through lines of pilgrims whose hands trembled as they reached out, fingertips brushing robes as if contact alone might be enough. Each touch carried a story, a plea, a hope sharpened by deprivation. The saint listened because listening had once been enough. Now it only made the weight heavier. The ecclesiarchy managed appearances with quiet efficiency. Audiences were scheduled. Blessings were rationed. Guards gently but firmly redirected the desperate when crowds grew too large. Behind the scenes, priests debated wording and emphasis, arguing over which of the saint's past statements would best reinforce morale without inviting doctrinal risk. The saint was present for some of these discussions, seated slightly apart, treated with reverence but not agency. When they spoke, the room fell silent. When they questioned, the silence grew strained. Their body continued to change in ways no Medicaid could quantify. Fatigue deepened, but so did something else, a sense of pressure building behind the eyes, beneath the skin, as if thought itself were becoming denser. During sermons, the saint sometimes felt words leave their mouth already weighted, already pulling on the listener's belief in ways intention could not fully control. Faces in the crowd would slacken or harden in unison, emotion spreading with unnatural coherence. The saint learned to shorten sentences, to speak carefully, but restraint only seemed to sharpen the effect. Miracles, once rare and ambiguous, became undeniable. A wounded guardsman rose from a stretcher, bleeding slowed to nothing beneath the saint's touch. A manufactorum fire guttered and died as the saint prayed aloud, flames collapsing inward without wind or suppressant. Each incident was documented meticulously, witnesses catalogued, narratives refined. The saint was never asked how these things felt. No one wanted to hear that each one left them weaker, hollowed out, as if something vital were being drawn through them and dispersed into the crowd. At night, the dreams returned, more vivid now. The saint would stand before a vast multitude, their voice echoing outward until it fractured into countless repetitions. Each echo returned altered, sharper, carrying commands they had never spoken. They would wake with their heart racing, hands clenched, the sense of being watched no longer abstract but intimate, invasive. Prayer offered no relief. The emperor's presence, once a constant pressure, felt distant, filtered through layers of ritual and expectation that dulled rather than clarified. The Astra Militarum began requesting the saint's presence explicitly, not for comfort, but for outcomes. Units stationed on collapsing fronts reported higher morale, fewer desertions, cleaner advances when the saint accompanied them. Officers spoke in careful tones about statistical anomalies and force multiplication, but the meaning was clear. Faith was being integrated into strategy. The saint overheard one commander remark that it was easier to order men into fire when a saint walked at the head of the column. The words were not meant to be cruel. They were practical. The saint confronted a senior priest after hearing that remark, voice low, controlled. They spoke of limits, of the danger of confusing belief with invulnerability. The priest listened patiently, hands folded, and then reminded the saint that doubt expressed publicly could wound more deeply than any enemy weapon. He did not threaten. He did not need to. The implication settled between them like dust as the saint prepared to address another mass of waiting faithful, standing beneath a sky bruised with smoke and distant fire. They felt the familiar pressure build once more. Thousands of eyes fixed on them, not in worship alone, but in demand. Whatever they said next would ripple outward, shaping decisions, justifying sacrifices yet to come. The saint inhaled, tasting ash and incense. and wondered not for the first time whether silence itself could be a form of betrayal. They spoke anyway. Silence, the saint had learned, was rarely interpreted as restraint. It became mystery, and mystery invited projection. Better to guide than to abandon. The words they chose were careful, stripped of flourish, focused on endurance and remembrance rather than victory. They urged the crowd to hold fast, to protect one another, to see the emperor's light in shared sacrifice rather than conquest. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. The mass exhaled as one, a sound like wind through broken stone. Many wept openly. Others straightened, resolve hardening in their posture. The saint felt the familiar drain, sharper this time, as if something had reached through them and pulled. Afterward, they were ushered away quickly, shielded from the surge of bodies by a wall of armored escorts. In the quiet of a sealed chamber, the saint sagged against the stone, vision blurring. A medicae moved in, murmuring reassurances, administering stimulants and nutrient infusions. The saint barely noticed. Their thoughts were fixed on the sensation of absence left behind after each address, like a limb gone numb. Whatever flowed through them did not replenish itself. It took dot travel blurred into ritual. Land, bless, speak, depart. Each world bore its own scars, its own flavor of desperation, but the pattern remained constant. On a mining moon where Necron activity had hollowed out entire settlements, the saint walked through tunnels lined with skulls set into the rock, prayers etched into the walls by trembling hands. On an agri-world stripped bare by requisition and plague, they stood amid fields of withered grain, the air thick with rot, and spoke of patience while children stared with hollow eyes. Each time, the saint left something behind: hope, certainly, but also an unspoken permission to endure whatever came next. The dreams worsened. They were no longer confined to sleep. At times, while fully awake, the saint would glimpse movement at the edges of vision shapes that vanished when focused upon, impressions of vastness pressing close. During one sermon, the saint lost their place mid-prayer, words dissolving into a hum that resonated through the crowd. For several heartbeats, no one moved. Then the ecclesiarchal choir swelled, drowning the sound, smoothing over the moment. Later, a priest assured the saint that such episodes were signs of deep spiritual alignment. The saint did not argue. They were too tired. In private, rumors reached them despite efforts to shield their attention. Whispers of other saints who had burned too brightly, whose relics now rested behind sealed reliquaries, their names omitted from common litanies. Tales of inquisitors arriving unannounced, of investigations framed as pilgrimages. The saint asked once quietly whether such things might happen to them. The answer was evasive, wrapped in assurances of trust and orthodoxy. Trust, the saint realized, was conditional. The Astra Militarum's reliance grew more explicit. On one world, a besieged city held out days longer than projections after the saint walked its walls, blessing defenders and the dead alike. Commanders cited the delay as proof of divine favor. They ordered a counteroffensive that cost tens of thousands of lives. The city was saved. The saint watched medicae tents overflow and felt the weight of that survival settle heavily on their chest. Was the miracle the endurance of the city or the willingness to spend so many lives in its name? That question followed them into the next campaign and the next. The saint began to measure their words not just by intent, but by projected consequence. They learned the language of caution, of implication, of omission. It did not always matter. Belief had momentum now, and momentum carries even careful speech forward at speed. One evening, as the saint stood alone before a small, unadorned shrine, they felt something new, a flicker of anger, sharp and startling. Not at the emperor, but at the system that had wrapped itself around his name so tightly it could no longer tell where faith ended and control began. The thought frightened them more than any vision. Anger implied judgment. Judgment implied distance. They extinguished the shrine's candles one by one, plunging the chamber into darkness, and whispered a prayer not found in any sanctioned text. For the first time since canonization, they did not know who, if anyone, was listening. The response to that unrecorded prayer did not come as a voice. It came as exhaustion so deep it bordered on detachment. The saint felt themselves moving through the following days as if slightly out of phase with the world around them, present but not entirely anchored. Faces blurred together. Applause became noise. Even pain lost some of its edge, replaced by a dull, constant pressure that settled behind the sternum and refused to lift. Medicae attributed it to strain. The ecclesiarchy framed it as sacrifice. The saint privately suspected it was neither. It felt less like giving something away, and more like being hollowed out to make room for something else. The incident that forced the realization came without ceremony. On a frontier world whose defenses were already failing, the saint was brought to a triage hall where wounded Astra Militarum soldiers lay packed so tightly the air had turned sour with blood and antiseptic. A young trooper, barely more than a child, reached out as the saint passed, fingers slick with someone else's life. He did not ask to be healed. He asked if it was worth it. The question landed harder than any accusation. The saint opened their mouth to answer, and nothing came. In that silence, something shifted. The trooper's breathing steadied. His eyes cleared. Not healed, not saved, but calmed, as if certainty had been imposed where doubt had lived moments before. The saint staggered back, heart racing. They had not spoken. They had not prayed. And yet belief had moved all the same from that day forward. The saint understood the truth the Imperium would never record plainly. Their presence alone was enough. Faith had saturated them so completely that intent was becoming optional. That knowledge terrified them. If miracles no longer required prayer, then restraint was the only barrier left, and restraint was not something the Imperium rewarded. The ecclesiarchy accelerated plans for broader deployment. New worlds, larger crowds, greater stakes. The saint listened as schedules were recited, routes plotted, sermons outlined in advance. Their role was discussed with reverence and efficiency, like a relic that could walk. When they objected quietly, carefully, the objections were acknowledged and then absorbed, stripped of force by consensus. Everyone agreed the burden was heavy. Everyone agreed it must still be carried. That night, the saint stood before a mirror for a long time, studying a face that no longer felt entirely their own. The eyes looked older than memory suggested, shadowed by knowledge gained too quickly. The halo depicted in devotional art was not visible, of course, but the saint could feel it, an invisible weight hovering just above the skull, held there by expectation alone. They wondered, briefly and dangerously, what would happen if they stepped out from under it. The thought did not leave by the time the transport engines ignited once more, carrying the saint toward yet another war-scarred system. The transformation was complete in all the ways that mattered. Survival had become symbol. Symbol had become leverage. And leverage, once recognized, would not be set aside willingly. As the stars stretched into lines and the familiar pressure built again, the saint closed their eyes and accepted what they could no longer deny. Faith, once shared, could be turned. The saint arrived on the next world under armed escort that made no effort to appear ceremonial. This was not pilgrimage. This was deployment. The landing zone lay outside a partially ruined hive whose outer district still burned in slow, sullen pockets. Smoke drifted low and heavy, carrying the bitter scent of promethium and wet ash. Artillery thunder rolled across the horizon with mechanical regularity, the sound no longer shocking but methodical, like a heartbeat sustained by machinery. The saint felt it immediately, the difference in atmosphere, in intent. Here, faith was not being asked to heal. It was being asked to justify. Astra Militarum officers greeted the saint with disciplined precision, salutes snapping to attention, eyes carefully neutral. Their respect was real, but it was a respect shaped by utility. This world was losing ground. Casualty projections were climbing faster than reinforcement timetables. Morale was fraying at the edges, not with panic, but with resignation, a far more dangerous state where soldiers stop believing outcomes can change. The saint was here to change that. They were brought first to the forward bastion. A slab of ferrocrete and adamantium sunk into the earth like a clenched fist. Inside, the air vibrated constantly with the whine of generators and the clipped cadence of vox traffic. Maps flickered across hololithic tables, red markers multiplying along breached sectors. The saint stood at the edge of the command chamber, watching commanders argue in lowered voices, each decision weighed against losses already accepted as inevitable. When the saint was finally addressed, it was with carefully chosen words. The officers did not ask for miracles. They asked for presence. The saint walked the trenches that evening. Mud clung to boots and robes alike, sucking at every step. Soldiers looked up as the saint passed, expressions shifting in ways too synchronized to be coincidence, spines straightening, hands tightening on lasguns, eyes sharpening with something dangerously close to certainty. The saint spoke softly, offering blessings that emphasized endurance rather than victory, but the effect was unmistakable. Faith spread through the ranks like an accelerant. Fear did not vanish. It transformed, narrowing into focus. That night, the saint learned what it meant to be a weapon. The assault began before dawn, artillery fire lifting just long enough for infantry to advance into the smoke. The saint was positioned behind the first wave, flanked by guards who watched the battlefield with the same intensity they watched the saint. As the troops surged forward, the saint felt the now familiar pressure swell, thicker and more insistent than ever before. Every prayer shouted, every whispered plea seemed to converge, funneling through them toward a single terrible purpose. Push forward. Hold the line. Do not break. When the enemy counterattacked, something snapped into place. The saint raised their voice not in command, but in exhortation, and the words carried farther than lungs should allow. Soldiers who had begun to falter steadied. Wounded men dragged themselves back into firing positions. A breach that should have collapsed held, bodies piling against it until the enemy advance stalled. The saint tasted copper and ash, felt blood trickle from their nose, but the effect did not lessen. It intensified. Hours later, when the smoke thinned and the firing slowed, the field belonged to the Imperium. The cost was staggering. Medicaid teams moved among the dead and dying, their expressions grim but unsurprised. Commanders spoke of success, of turning points, of the Emperor's favor made manifest. They clasped the saint's hands with something approaching awe. The saint could barely stand. In the aftermath, reports circulated quickly. Casualty ratios were lower than projected. Unit cohesion had held beyond expectation. The saint's presence was cited repeatedly, footnotes accumulating beneath official praise. No one mentioned the way soldiers had advanced into fire without hesitation, or the way some had kept fighting long after their bodies should have failed. No one called it coercion. It was faith. Faith was clean. Later, alone in a reinforced chamber, the saint stared at their shaking hands and understood the horror of what had occurred. They had not ordered anyone forward. They had not chosen who lived or died. And yet their presence had stripped choice away all the same. Obedience had not been demanded. It had been inspired. The realization settled like a weight on the soul. If belief could be shaped into a weapon this easily, then the Imperium would never stop using it. And if the saint continued to walk these battlefields, continued to lend their voice and presence to war, then every death that followed would carry their shadow outside. The guns began to thunder again. The days that followed blurred into a grim routine, each one reinforcing the lesson the saint wished they had never learned. After action reports were read aloud in command chambers heavy with the smell of recaf and ozone, numbers scrolling across data slates with clinical detachment, losses were framed as acceptable. Gains were highlighted, praised, sanctified. The saint's name appeared again and again in margins and annotations, never as an order given, always as a presence noted. Wherever the saint stood, the line had held. Wherever they walked, hesitation had diminished. This was not coincidence. Everyone knew it. No one said it plainly. Soldiers began to seek the saint out before engagements, not for comfort, but for certainty. They asked to be blessed not after battle, but before, hands steady as they removed helmets, eyes fixed with a dangerous calm. The saint complied because refusal felt like abandonment, and abandonment, in this context, felt like murder by omission. Each blessing tightened the invisible thread binding belief to obedience. Each one made it easier for commanders to push men harder, farther, into situations they might once have reconsidered. The saint attempted to limit exposure, to retreat into advisory roles, but the requests only grew more insistent. Vox channels crackled with appeals rooted through ecclesiarchal authority, framed as spiritual necessity. A unit had broken morale. A flank was wavering. The saint's presence was required. Required. The word echoed louder than any prayer. They went, because not going meant imagining the outcome without them, and that imagination had become unbearable. It was during a prolonged siege that the saint witnessed the clearest consequence of their influence. The enemy held a manufacturing complex whose defenses were layered and brutal, its corridors choked with fire and shrapnel. Assaults had failed repeatedly. Casualties mounted. The saint was brought to the staging area as a last resort. Commanders did not hide their hope. They spoke openly of sacrifice, of the emperor's will demanding resolve. The saint stood before the assembled troops and felt the pressure crest, belief pressing so hard it bordered on pain. They spoke of duty, of humanity's long war, of standing firm so others might live another day. The words were not lies. They were incomplete truths, sharpened by context. When the assault came, the troops advanced into killing zones with terrifying cohesion. They did not break. They did not fall back. They climbed over the dead and kept moving, driven by a certainty that bordered on ecstasy. The manufacturum fell. The casualty count was catastrophic. In the aftermath, the saint walked through corridors slick with blood and machine oil, past bodies still clutching weapons, expressions frozen in grim resolve. There was no triumph here, no sense of victory worth the cost. Only the quiet horror of knowing that without their presence, some of these men might have hesitated. Some might have lived. The saint knelt among the dead and whispered prayers until their voice gave out, the words feeling thinner with each repetition. Rumors began to circulate, even among the ranks. Some soldiers spoke of feeling compelled, of a warmth in the chest that drowned out fear. Others described it as clarity, a stripping away of doubt. None called it coercion. They were grateful. Gratitude, the saint realized, was the most effective camouflage of all. The ecclesiarchy praised the outcome publicly, framing it as proof of divine favor. Privately, schedules tightened. The saints' movements were planned with increasing precision, their presence allocated like a strategic asset. Guards doubled. Escorts grew heavier. The saint was no longer simply protected. They were contained. One evening, after yet another sanctioned address, the saint overheard a junior officer speaking to his superior, voice low but earnest. He said it was easier this way. Easier to send men forward when they believed so completely that death itself felt purposeful. The superior nodded, offering no correction. The saint felt something inside them fracture, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet finality of a seal breaking. They withdrew that night to a small, unadorned chamber and sat in silence, hands resting on knees, breath shallow. For the first time since their elevation, they considered refusal not as heresy, but as mercy. The thought did not bring relief. It brought fear. Fear of what the Imperium would do if its weapon chose not to fire. Outside, the war continued, indifferent to introspection. Orders were issued. Troops moved. Belief surged and settled, ready to be drawn upon again. The saint remained seated, staring at the wall, understanding with brutal clarity that obedience, once sanctified, could not be easily reclaimed. The saint's withdrawal did not go unnoticed. In the Imperium, absence is read as deviation long before it is granted the courtesy of concern. Ecclesiarchal attendants adjusted schedules, then tightened them again. Guards lingered closer. Conversations grew more careful, more scripted. No accusations were made, because none were required. The saint felt the shift as a subtle cooling of the air, a recalibration of trust that left everything looking the same while meaning something entirely different. It was during this period that rumor began to reach them in earnest, slipping through layers of protection like dust through seals. Not official briefings, not reports whispers carried by servants, by tired priests who spoke too freely when they thought themselves unseen. Stories of saints whose relics were enshrined with great ceremony and then quietly removed from rotation. Of miracles declared authentic and then reclassified, their documentation sealed beneath inquisitorial sigils. Of faith that burned hot enough to warp outcomes and then had to be extinguished for the sake of order. The saint listened and said nothing, but each story lodged like a splinter. The visions changed. Where once there had been vague impressions and pressure, now there were moments of clarity so sharp they bordered on intrusion. During prayer, the saint would glimpse vast processions of humanity stretching across impossible distances, each figure repeating the same words with mechanical devotion. The sound was overwhelming, not a chorus but a grinding roar, as if belief itself were being fed into some unseen engine. The saint would pull back gasping, heart hammering, unsure whether they had witnessed a revelation or simply the cumulative weight of too many expectations collapsing inward. They sought counsel, cautiously. A senior priest listened as the saint described the sensations, not the visions themselves, but the doubt they provoked. He nodded sympathetically, fingers steepled, and spoke of trial and temptation. He reminded the saint that proximity to the emperor's work often brought confusion, that the human mind was not built to withstand such strain without distortion. The saint asked, quietly, how one distinguished divine burden from systemic misuse. The priest's smile did not falter, but his answer slid sideways, offering reassurance without engagement. The saint understood then that the question itself was dangerous. At night, when the basilica corridors fell quiet, the saint walked alone, fingertips trailing along cold stone etched with prayers older than entire civilizations. They wondered how many of those who had carved these words had felt what they now felt. This sense of standing too close to something vast and unyielding, unsure whether it would illuminate or crush. The emperor remained distant in these moments, an immovable presence defined more by what he was not than what he revealed. The golden throne, the Astronomican symbols of endurance and guidance, felt impossibly far away, mediated through layers of doctrine that blurred rather than clarified their meaning. The first overt intervention came cloaked as concern. An inquisitorial envoy arrived without announcement, rosette displayed openly, manner polite and precise. He spoke with the saint in a chamber stripped of iconography, the air sterile and still. He asked about fatigue, about visions, about the weight of expectation. His questions were careful, designed to sound pastoral while mapping boundaries. When he spoke of other saints, it was in historical terms, referencing approved texts and sanitized outcomes. The saint answered honestly because dishonesty felt pointless. The envoy listened, took notes, and reminded the saint that the Imperium valued stability above all else. Afterward, restrictions increased. Sermons were reviewed in advance. Appearances shortened. Access narrowed. The saint was not accused of heresy. They were protected from it. The distinction mattered less with each passing day. Doubt, once internal, now felt mirrored by the system surrounding them. A silent standoff where neither side could afford to move openly. The saint began to understand that their crisis was not unique. It was structural. Faith in the Imperium was not designed for nuance. It was a tool, refined over 10,000 years to produce obedience reliably and at scale. Saints were anomalies tolerated only so long as they reinforced that function. The moment a saint questioned the machinery they empowered, they became a variable, and variables invite correction. One evening, alone before an unlit altar, the saint whispered a thought they had never dared to fully form. What if the Emperor did not want this? What if the endless grind of sacrifice, sanctified by necessity, was something humanity had built around him rather than something he demanded? The thought did not feel blasphemous. It felt dangerous in a far more practical sense. The candles remained dark. The silence pressed close. And for the first time, the saint did not pray for guidance. They prayed for the strength to endure whatever answer might come if they stopped pretending certainty still existed. The answer, when it came, arrived not as revelation but as fracture. The saint felt it during a sanctioned address delivered to a reduced audience. Their words pre-approved, their movements carefully staged. Halfway through the sermon, a tremor ran through the gathered faithful. Not fear, but confusion. Faces tightened. Murmurs rippled outward. The saint sensed the shift before they understood it, a subtle resistance where once belief had flowed without friction. For a heartbeat, the weight lifted, and in that absence, something cold and sharp pressed back. The saint faltered. Just for a moment. It was enough. Later, the ecclesiarchy would frame the incident as exhaustion, a minor lapse caused by strain. The official record would note nothing unusual. But the saint knew what had happened. For the first time since their canonization, belief had not moved in unison. It had hesitated. And in that hesitation, the machinery that fed on certainty had reacted, not with wrath, but with adjustment. The days that followed were marked by a tightening of doctrine. New litanies circulated emphasizing obedience over interpretation. Choirs replaced open prayer in gatherings where the saint was present, their voices drowning out spontaneous devotion. The saint's role shifted subtly from focal point to component, one element among many carefully balanced inputs. The pressure did not lessen. It redistributed, pressing from the outside rather than drawing from within. Privately, the saint's visions grew more disturbing. They no longer showed crowds or symbols, but mechanisms, vast, unseen systems grinding belief into fuel, humanity reduced to countless points of light drawn inexorably toward a central void. Whether this was the warp reflecting collective emotion, or merely the saint's own mind breaking under strain, they could not tell. They only knew that the sensation of being watched had intensified, no longer distant, but immediate. As if something leaned close whenever they closed their eyes. Another inquisitorial visit followed, this one less conversational. Questions were direct. timelines were clarified. The saint was asked calmly whether they still believed themselves aligned with the Emperor's will. The wording was careful, offering space for the correct answer. The saint gave it. Anything else would have been suicidal, not just for themselves, but for those whose lives were now entangled with their continued existence. After the envoy departed, the saint sat alone for a long time, listening to the hum of distant generators and the muted echo of hymns through stone. They understood now that doubt, once noticed, could never be unseen. The Imperium did not fear heresy as much as it feared instability, and a saint who questioned the function of faith itself was the most unstable figure imaginable. The realization was oddly clarifying. If belief could be shaped, redirected, and weaponized without consent, then the saint's remaining choice was not between obedience and rebellion, but between complicity and consequence. They did not yet know what form that consequence would take, only that it was approaching, measured, and inevitable, like the slow turning of colossal gears. The decision, when it finally came, did not feel like rebellion. It felt like procedure. That was the most unsettling part. There was no single moment of defiance, no dramatic refusal etched into memory. Instead, there was a sequence of perfectly correct actions performed with perfectly correct reverence, each one aligned with doctrine, each one impossible to condemn without admitting the flaw beneath it. The saint was assigned to a world, already lost in everything but name. Its hive still stood, its banners still flew, but the foundations were compromised, supply lines severed, morale hollowed, authority maintained only through repetition. The saint understood why they had been sent, not to save the world, to stabilize its end. Faith, properly applied, could make collapse orderly. It could turn panic into acceptance, chaos into ritual. The Imperium did not require victory here. It required compliance. Crowds gathered as they always did, thinner now, faces sharper with hunger and exhaustion. The saint stood before them beneath a sky the color of old, bruises, and spoke the approved words: duty, endurance, sacrifice. The phrases slid easily into place, familiar grooves worn deep by centuries of use. The people listened. They always listened. And yet, this time, something else was threaded through the sermon, nothing overt, nothing that could be isolated and condemned. The saint spoke of choice, of the Emperor's light as something humanity carried forward together, not something imposed from above. They framed obedience as a shared burden rather than an unquestioned command. The effect was subtle, but immediate. The crowd did not surge. They did not fall to their knees. Instead, they looked at one another. Whispers spread, not of rebellion, but of consideration. For the first time in a long while, belief slowed. The saint felt the backlash at once. The familiar pressure twisted, no longer drawing outward but pressing inward with sharp insistence. Pain flared behind the eyes, down the spine. For a moment, the world tilted, and the saint wondered if this was how it ended, not with execution or condemnation, but with collapse, the body finally refusing to carry what it had been forced to bear. They steadied themselves and continued, voice trembling but unbroken. That was enough. The response came later, as responses in the Imperium always do, quietly, efficiently. An inquisitorial directive rerouted the saint's transport. Ecclesiarchal escorts were placed with custodian guard presence at a respectful distance, not accusatory, but unmistakable. No charges were read. No crime named. The saint was informed they would be undergoing doctrinal review, their activities temporarily suspended for the good of the faithful. Temporarily, in the Imperium, is a word without edges. As the ship cut through the void, the saint stood alone in a small observation chamber, watching the stars smear into pale lines. They felt lighter than they had in years. Weaker, certainly. The pressure had receded, leaving behind a hollow ache and a quiet clarity. Whatever had flowed through them was no longer being drawn upon. Whether it had been the Emperor's will, the warp's reflection of mass belief, or something born entirely of human desperation, they could no longer say. They only knew that it no longer owned them. Records would be amended. Sermons would be revised. The saints' later words would be omitted from common liturgy, their legacy preserved in an earlier, safer form. Shrines would remain, but the emphasis would shift, the edges sanded smooth. Officially, nothing had gone wrong. Officially, the saint had served faithfully. Somewhere, though, among the people who had heard that final sermon, something persisted. A hesitation. A memory of belief that did not demand surrender of thought. It would not spread far. The Imperium was too vast, too practiced at containment. But it would exist. And that, perhaps, was the most dangerous outcome of all. The saint closed their eyes as the ship carried them onward, not toward martyrdom or triumph, but toward obscurity. In the Imperium of man, that was the closest thing to mercy still permitted. And as the galaxy turned, grinding onward beneath the weight of its own survival, the question lingered unspoken, buried beneath layers of sanctioned truth. If even a saint could become a weapon, what shape, then, did heresy truly take?